Greetings and welcome to 303. This is a series of lectures on the Bible. The genesis of this project actually comes from a while ago when I was giving a lecture on the Odyssey. And to introduce the Odyssey to a group of AP students, I began to ask questions about how other texts also have Odysseys. And I mentioned the Odyssey of, for example, Abraham in the Bible, and I waited for students to show me that they understood. And when a number of students gave me that blank stare, I said, well, it's like the Odysseys, for example, of Paul in the New Testament. And again, my students gave me a strange look. And I kind of recognized that maybe it's possible that a good number of my students are now coming to me, arriving in room 303 without really any kind of exposure to the text, the Bible. So I'm now going to suggest maybe that you want to follow along in a series of conversations with me about biblical text. So let's get into it. There it is, sitting, in your hotel room, a doctor's office, maybe they're next to the bed in the hospital room. It seems to me there are two questions that a lot of people over the years have said to me when they look at the Bible. The first question is, why read it? And the second question is, how to read it. But I think the more important question is the one that we want to ask right now, and that is, quite literally, what is it? I think that it's important that maybe we begin here. Welcome again to a series of comments about the Bible. This is made specifically for my students in 303 who are studying in the humanities classes with me at the AP level and elsewhere. Of course, I'm very happy to welcome others into this conversation as well. Our goal is to introduce you to the Bible, starting with two introductory lectures. In the first, we're going to address really what the Bible is, why we should care to read it. We'll discuss ways to actually read it, and outline what we will call a non-apologetic approach to the study of the Bible. In the second lecture, I'll actually talk a little bit more about the history of the text, and we'll actually practice, reading a very special passage, Psalm 137 from the Bible. So let's just begin with the question again. What is the Bible? Now, there are, of course, religious answers to this question. If you ask, for example, a religious believer of Christianity, he or she will say that, of course, the Bible is the quote-unquote Word of God. Non-religious answers as well can be given to this question, what is the Bible? We want to look at the book the way we might any other literary text that we would study in 303, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and to that degree now we'll ask again, what is this book, this Bible as we look at it? And the answer actually is, well, it's an anthology, not unlike the anthology sitting on your desk right now that we read from in a humanities class or an English class. A collection of different types of writing and genres composed over about 1,100 years, certainly over 1,000 years of writing in multiple languages. Typically, we will say them as Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. Therefore, obviously, unless we're properly trained, we're going to be reading in some kind of translation. The writings are collected over a long period of time. For example, today, we don't have a single what we call, quote-unquote, original text of the Bible. Normally, we divide this text up into two parts. What is referred to often as the Old Testament and the New Testament. Sometimes there's a collection of middle books called the Apocrypha. I should point out, these are Christian terms that we give to these. Jews will refer to the Old Testament as simply the Hebrew Bible. The Bible itself, I should point out, doesn't actually call itself the Bible or the Holy Bible. So if you start to read the book and you want to see this term, this is a term that's applied after the fact. The actual word Bible comes from the Greek biblia, which just simply means little books, that is to say, a collection of some kind. The anthology, though, understanding is significant because what we're going to say right away is that if you sit down and just try to read this book the way you would, for example, the Iliad, the Odyssey, or a novel, you're going to quickly become very frustrated unless you have quite a bit of background information to help you. That's one of the reasons I'm giving this series of lectures. We will actually follow our study of the Bible chronologically from Genesis to Revelation, but for lots and lots of people, I speak oftentimes with religious people who, as I was preparing for these lectures, they said to me, I'm really kind of excited to know that you're going to give this series of lectures, because I got to be honest, for any number of reasons, I was told for a long time, you should read the Bible. And so I would sit down at Genesis and I would start reading, and I could get normally through to like Leviticus or Numbers somewhere, and I'd get bogged down, and man, it was just really hard for me to ever, and I got to be honest, I never actually read the entire Bible, and this will be one of the great challenges for us. Every year I give to my AP students in the summer the challenge of reading the entire Bible, and I'm going to challenge viewers of these lectures to say, read the Bible with me as we move through the different chapters, the different texts, the different passages. First, let's talk though really quickly, and if you're taking notes, you may want to write a bit of this information down. First, the Old Testament. Originally intended for a Jewish community, we're going to call it 12th to 2nd centuries BCE, roughly speaking. The New Testament, as often is, and again, this is a Christian term, the New Testament originally intended for Jewish and then, of course, Christian communities from about 50 Common Era to about 150 Common Era. These dates, and we'll talk more about these dates, they are, of course, the subject of huge debate within theology circles. If you open the Bible up, and if you have one in front of you, I recommend that you do this, you will notice then that the table of contents allows you to count then 39 Old Testament books, 27 New Testament books for a collection of 66 books. So now let's ask this question. And I'm actually asked this question regularly, especially among non-religious students that were raised around no religion whatsoever. Why read a religious book? Why read the Bible? I think this is a good question. And I'll go ahead and say that, well, the first reason that I recommend and I want to talk about this book is quite simply, I love it. I like to talk about it. No single book has been more influential in my life, and I would guess in the lives of many, many humanists that lecture in the humanities and in the arts. But there's a lot of reasons people will give for why they read this book. Religious, obviously, is one, but cultural, historical, economic comes to mind, moral, ethical, linguistic, legal, entertainment, academic, literary, the list can go on and on for reasons, and maybe I would hope you will discover your own reasons, in fact, for reading the book. Of course, each of these that I just listed, from the religious to the economic to the moral, ethical to the linguistic, each of them, of course, have their strengths and also, of course, their weaknesses. For example, if you're not religious, you might assume you have no reason to read the Bible. Or if you look at the Bible strictly as a book to derive a moral code, for example. Okay, I'm going to pick up this book and I'm going to read it to know how I should behave towards other people. There's going to be some examples in this book that will be a little bit questionable. We think of Numbers 15:33 here. A man is stoned for picking up sticks, a violation of what was known as the Sabbath. Of course, knowing that passage will then help us when we read a New Testament passage. In Matthew 12, we're told that Jesus, quote unquote, violated the Sabbath, and the reasons why that was such a big dog deal when it happened. You have to know the first story to understand the second, but be that as it may, the question of reading the Bible for moral, ethical reasons can maybe be problematic for some readers. We'll read the Bible predominantly, though, for literary reasons. For example, and here's another reason why I'm giving this series of lectures. I was lecturing Hamlet just the other day, and I pointed out, it's fascinating that Shakespeare has Hamlet in the middle of the play call Polonius Jephthah, judge of Israel. And I kind of worked off of the assumption for a number of years while I was lecturing Hamlet that my students understood what this reference was to and why this is such a compelling reference at the moment that it was given. If you don't understand the story of Jephthah in Judges 11, we'll get to this story obviously, you've got issues in understanding exactly the game that Shakespeare is playing. And of course, Once you finish reading the Bible, you will be stunned at how many times there are allusions, 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 references made to biblical text. Of course, I could give a whole bunch of examples of this for AP students, but I'll just give classically two. It's very difficult to really read Paradise Lost, Milton's classic poem, without some understanding of not only the Genesis 3 account, but the entire Bible, the whole scope of both Old and New Testament. We think, of course, don't we, of John Steinbeck's classic East of Eden as a classic example of if you don't know the storyline of Cain and Abel, you may struggle to really appreciate what's happening in this book. Let me tell you right now how we won't read this volume of the Bible. We're not going to argue with the validity of the text. You know, the questions, is it true? Is it not? I'll give you a classic example of this. When we pick up Iliad and we jump into Iliad 21, you know, a famous scene where Achilles wrestles with the river Scamander. We don't argue about whether this story is true or not. We rather study the text from what? Its literary and its figurative perspective, right? Think of it this way. Generally speaking, there are two ways to approach the study of the Bible. What I call the apologetic approach and the non-apologetic approach, okay? Let's outline the apologetic approach real quickly. It seeks basically to consider either what's right or what's wrong with the text, the Bible. All right. So, for example, the arguments from readers that would say things like, the virgin birth of Jesus Christ really did happen, or there is no way the sun stands still in the Joshua 10:13 passage, or Christ never actually rose from the dead. These are all going to be approaches that look at the Bible as a work of religion or theology, or a skeptical reader trying to say all of this, much of this is not true, it never actually happened. This is what we would call the apologetic approach. The non-apologetic approach, which is the one that we will employ in our series of lectures, is a different way to look at the Bible. We're not going to argue if the text is true or false. Our approach will rather be to study what the text actually says, what the text means, and how we can relate to it and how other writers have related to the text. This is what we will refer to in 303, of course, as the annotative approach. So what we will be doing is annotating the biblical text. Okay? Now think about it this way, and this non-apologetic approach is actually born of an epistemological view. Now let's talk about epistemology for a second. In the study of philosophy, epistemology just simply means epistis, over, related to knowledge. Yes, we've spoken about this in 303 many times. Epistemology basically suggests there's kind of three ways to say that you know something, or that you're certain about something or not certain about something in terms of knowledge. One position on an extreme is what we will call the absolutist position. I absolutely know things to be 100% absolutely true. I'm right. Anybody that disagrees with me is wrong. Of course, the only problem with this approach, as we have seen and witnessed in history, is tragically airplanes fly into buildings and lots of people die. Because that's the case, very regularly, people will cling to another epistemological position on the complete opposite extreme, what we call the relativist position. There is nothing that's absolute. Absolute is kind of a myth. There's no such thing as any kind of legitimate, real truth. Everything is relative. There are no truths. Of course, the problem with this position is what we call the performative contradiction. To say there are no truths is to posit one truth, right? And so an extreme relativist position, well, we fall into the same problem all over again, which is a reason why a lot of people jump back to the absolutist position and say, well, obviously you can't be a relativist, so I guess I just have to pick things and absolutely believe them. This is not actually true, though, for us. We will use this middle position that we will call the fallibilist position. And it basically runs something like this. It says, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. And I'm open to all kinds of further investigation. This is, of course, the scientific method, as long as science doesn't become scientism. And, it's always looking to try to challenge its positions. And this is our non-apologetic approach, right? What this means is that we'll approach the text out of a sense of wonder and curiosity. I mean, we're gonna ask questions, obviously. For example, if the text tells us that God created the world by speaking, we may ask the simple question, maybe not so simple, if God created the world by speaking, what language did God speak when God created this world? Or, for example, if the virgin birth is such a critically important element in the story of the biography of Christ, then why doesn't he himself ever mention it in the Gospels as recorded in the New Testament? Now, when we ask questions like this, we're not trying to reduce or devalue the text, but rather enhance the text in the same way that we would any other literary text. For example, in the opening book of Iliad, why is it that a woman who is being fought over is not allowed to do any speaking? Where is her voice in all of this? We'll ask questions like this, but we'll do it from a non-apologetic approach. We're not here to try to in any way call into question the absolutist position from the religious perspective of the reading of biblical text. We, of course, want to celebrate and honor that reading of the text, but we're here for a completely different reason, and our approach is to say, what does the text actually say? What does it mean? And how can we relate to it? And how have other writers related to it? Now, we will, here in the final minutes of this conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about our reading approach to the text, okay? We're going to ask 3 questions, and if you're taking notes, I recommend that now you probably do write down 1 or 2 ideas. We're going to take the biblical text, and we're going to take the approach of our annotative approach in 303, which ostensibly asks and tries to answer 3 questions about any text that we pick up. 1, we're going to ask, what does the text say? Here we're just simply looking to provide some kind of summary of the passage. For example, if we're picking up Iliad 21, we're simply going to say that this is, of course, where Achilles will fight the river Scamander and the implications of that. Our second question is a little more interesting than simply what does the text say. Now we're very interested in what does the text mean. Here, we're going to study text from a thematic perspective, right? We're also going to study the rhetorical techniques, the literary techniques, not what the author says, but how the author says it. For example, what could it mean that Achilles fights a river or the river fights with Achilles? From a figurative perspective, the idea of, for example, challenging nature. Well, immediately, won't we think of Captain Ahab in Melville's Moby Dick as a classic example. We're going to note maybe the rhetorical technique of personification. Notice, for example, that in the Iliad, as of course in the Bible and elsewhere, you're going to have nature sometimes personified as human or anthropomorphic. And this is, of course, an interesting way to analyze or study the text. Our final question, question 3 of a text, what does the text say? What does the text mean? The third question asks about relational questions. How does this text relate? First to maybe other texts, and we'll do this a lot. We do this, of course, in 303 when we pick up any text. We're always asking how can we relate new information to old information. It's actually how we define learning in 303. We'll do something very similar here, of course. And then, of course, finally, and most importantly for any number of reasons, memory and the other reasons we've already talked about many times, trying to relate somehow personally to the text will help us as well. We're going to try and make the text in some ways we might say our own, right? For example, back to the Iliad 21 passage, we might think about other texts, for example, where heroes fight against forces of nature. The film Perfect Storm comes to mind, doesn't it, immediately? Moses crossing the Red Sea, the crossing of the Jordan by Joshua comes to mind. Of course, Christ walking on the water. Or even, the story in Genesis 32:24 of Jacob in his wrestling all night with some kind of strange figure. We'll talk about why this is such a significant moment and the name change to follow. And of course, for those of us who are, interested in, the classic rock and roll song Stairway to Heaven, we're going to, obviously have some relationship now. Finally, maybe we'll understand some of what that's all about. Finally, at the personal level, and I'm really going to challenge you when you do this reading to go here as well, is to ask personal questions about what does it mean, for example, back to the Iliad 21 passage, what does it mean to fight against the forces of nature? We'll, of course, have some discussion about what it means, for example, in Genesis 1, when there's a certain kind of command to be fruitful and multiply, and maybe it seems to even subdue nature in some way. What is humans' relationship to nature? Are we somehow a part of it, or are we somehow external to it? And of course, here immediately we start to think about Ralph Waldo Emerson's classic essay, Nature, and many of the positions that are held by really influential writers as they think about their own personal relationship to nature. Of course, we'll ask the same question about ourselves. What is our relationship maybe to nature? Antagonistic, or somehow a collegiality, or some combination of the two? We'll think of our, of course, great romantic poet Blake and his songs of innocence and songs of experience. The lamb, the tiger will immediately come to mind, and the ways in which nature is personified in many ways in the poems of those two classic texts. Our non-apologetic approach to the Bible then will help us, and this is really the reason for this series of lectures, to be better readers in all things that we pick up in 303, and then of course for the rest of our life outside of school. We'll ask questions then that we'll be able to answer once we've read text, or at least be able to answer better. For example, when we study Beowulf, we meet the monster Grendel. He's a pretty nasty monster, and we're told in the passage Grendel bears the mark of Cain. Now, if we're unfamiliar with the early stories of the book of Genesis, that first book of the Bible, we're not going to really appreciate exactly what's going on here and the multiple levels of what's going on here. Not